From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thanks so much for coming out, everyone. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you to tonight's event, International Literature, Uruguayan Poetry, focusing on the poet Idea Vilariño. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress, and I would like to thank the chief of the Hispanic Division, Georgette Dorn, up here on the stage, who will participate in the bilingual reading section of the event. I also want to thank our presenting partner, Poet Lore. This is the second time in 3 years that we've gotten a chance to work with them, and we're thrilled to continue the relationship. We've had the chance again to champion Poet Lore's World Poets in Translation publication through an international literature event. I want to make a special thanks to the staff, including editor Jody Boltz right here. Thank you, Jody. And managing editor Genevieve DeLeon in the back. Both clearly have some fans in the audience. If you want to find out more about Poet Lore, for those of you who have not seen the magazine, you can, of course, pick up a copy outside after this event, but you can also visit their website, www.poetlore.org. Poet Lore has its home in the Writers Center in Bethesda, and I want to thank the center's new executive director, Joe Callahan, who's right here. We're proud to say that as a normal citizen, Joe is also a member of our Poet Laureate Circle, so he supports poetry in all sorts of wonderful ways. This event is also made possible due to the support of poets and writers, the James Irvine Foundation, and the Hearst Foundation, so much thanks to them. And finally, I would like to ask all of you to join me in recognizing the cultural attaché in the General Council of Uruguay, Marcela Manu, right here. And is Ana Esteves here? Ana Esteves in the back, the Council General. Thanks so much for being here and making this a truly international event. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones, which I'm going to do myself, and any other electronic devices that you have that might interfere with the recording of tonight's event. I would also like to note that this program is being audio and video recorded for the Library of Congress, and by participating in the question and answer period later on, you give the library permission for future use of your recordings. So don't say anything crazy. Let me also tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center here at the library. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. We actually have our first Hispanic Poet Laureate, Juan Felipe Herrera, who is kicking off his second term next fall. But we put on literary readings, lectures, and panels of all sorts throughout the year. If you would like to find out more about events like this, please sign our sign-up sheet, which is outside. You can also check us out online at loc.gov/poetry. And if you're interested in more events sponsored by the Hispanic Division, they have all sorts of information out there, brochures in English and in Spanish to pick up and check out. And you can visit their website at loc.gov/rr/Hispanic. You all, as you came in, got some forms, some survey forms. We've got a good crowd tonight. I'm hoping that many of you take the time to fill out the form after the event and hand it to us. You can give it to me, you can put it on the table. It gives us the opportunity to hear your voice, get a sense of what you think about this event, and improve our events going forward. So please do fill that out. So tonight's event will work as follows. Jesse Lee Kercheval, translator of Idea Vilariño's work, will participate in a bilingual reading with our beloved Hispanic Division Chief, and afterwards, Hispanic Division Reference Librarian Catalina Gomez will lead a moderated discussion. We'll have plenty of time for your questions in the end, and we hope you pick up the copies of Poet Lore on the table outside, as well as The Invisible Bridge, co-edited by Jesse Lee. You're going to hear a little bit more about Jesse Lee in just a second, but I want to tell you how excited I am to feature someone I've known as a tremendous writer, teacher, and professor since my undergraduate days more than 2 decades ago. And now, to find out more about Jesse Lee, please join me in welcoming the translation editor of Poet Lore, Suzanne Zweizig.
Hi, everyone. I just want to reiterate Rob's welcome and thank you to all the parties who made this happen, and especially our gracious hosts, the Library of Congress Poetry and Literature Center and Hispanic Division. It's just really wonderful to work with you all. And especially it has been wonderful to work with Jesse Lee on this portfolio. It's just been such an honor and a pleasure. And I just want to tell you a little story about how this portfolio came to be, because I think it says a lot about Jesse Lee and her role as a translator and what translation means. It was about 2 years ago, I guess, we met at Alta, and somebody came up to me. They knew I was looking for a portfolio for that issue of Poet Lore, and they said, "You've got to meet Jesse Lee. She's doing all this wonderful work with Uruguayan writers." And then, as it turns out, we have a mutual friend, and we ended up having lunch together. And at the time, Jesse Lee was really working on her translations of Circe Maya, and she, after the conference, she sent me a whole manuscript of the poems, and they were wonderful. They were really good. But at the same time, I had received a manuscript of another poet, Rira Abbasi, an Iranian poet, and Jesse Lee's poems, a lot of them, the ones from Circe Maya, had already been published, and none of the poems from this Rira Abbasi, this Iranian poet, had ever been published in English before, and Jesse Lee had the book coming out. And so thinking about Poet Lore's, emphasis on discovery and bringing new voices to people, I made a really hard decision, and it was really hard to write the email, but I said to Jesse Lee, I love these poems, but you've got so many out and the book's coming out, and I've got this opportunity to publish this poet who's never been read in English before. And she said, I would have done exactly the same thing. And I think I told our managing editor, Jen, about that, and she said, that was like the perfect response. And I said yes, and not only because it was gracious and kind, but also I think because it embodies the spirit of translation, which is you are putting forth somebody else's work. You're expanding the circle so that more voices can come in, not just promoting your own voice. And that really made an impression on me. And then this year, as I was looking, I remember Jesse Lee had said, well, I'll be doing other writers. So I sent an email out. And lucky for me, not only is Jesse Lee gracious and generous, but she's hardworking and prolific and talented. And I got back the next day this manuscript, 50-page manuscript of Idea Vilariño, she had been working on. And it was one of those moments when you open up the document on your computer and you're transported to another place, And I think Vilariño's poems aren't so much the place of Uruguay, but a place in her mind that was different. And that's that trans word for translation. You're carried somewhere else. So Jesse Lee's skill and her subtlety as a translator really brought through what we strive for in translation, to capture the voice of somebody. And I'm really excited that you're going to hear that voice tonight. As Rob already said, Jesse Lee's a professor, the Zona Gale Professor of English at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of 13 acclaimed books, novels, memoirs, poems, short stories, and her recent translations include Invisible Bridge, which is out here tonight for you, and she's just coming out, I think when is it coming out, the anthology? September 15th, an anthology of emerging Uruguayan women, emerging Uruguayan poets is coming out from the University of Mexico, and I've got a lot of hope for the Idea Vilariño manuscript too, but in the meantime, you can see the portfolio of the poems in the Poet Lore issue. When I think about Jesse Lee and translation, Uruguayan literature, I think of that line from Frank O'Hara's The Day Lady Died, where he said he wandered off to the store to find a book to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. And I think, thanks to Jesse Lee, we can, find out what the poets in Uruguay are doing these days. So thank you.
Idea Vilariño is an amazing poet, and she's actually a very amazingly famous poet. So that recently when Copper Canyon published, which is a very important press, does many things, but a lot of translation, published their essential poems of Latin America, I was irritated to see that there were only 3 women in it, but Idea Vilariño was one of them. But she doesn't have a book in English translated, and these poems are from her most famous book, Poemas de Amor, Love Poems. She was born in 1920 and she died in 2009 and lived her whole life in Montevideo, Uruguay. But the Poemas de Amor are a really fascinating story. Idea Vilariño was part of what's called the Generation of 45 in Uruguay, which included Mario Benedetti and a sort of an ex officio Argentine member, Jorge Luis Borges. She fell madly in love with one of the most important members of the group, the Cervantes Prize-winning novelist Juan Carlos Onetti, who was 10 years older than she was. And I wish I could show you pictures because Idea Vilariño looks like a young Lauren Bacall. She's gorgeous. And I hate to say it, but Onetti looks like a frog wearing big glasses. And so their love affair is very famous in Uruguay and in Latin America. It's sort of a Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart romance. He dedicated a book to her. She wrote these poems to him. So every amor, every love in the poem in the book is addressed to him. But it has a story sort of almost beyond their love. She first wrote it as a tiny, tiny little book in 1957, and then every edition got... Did it go out? Every edition... Every edition, technical problem. Every edition got larger until she revised it again. I feel like it's going in and out. Is it going in and out? Yeah. Can you just hear me? Yes.
Yeah. You got it.
Okay. I'll do the introduction part, right? We're having a technical moment. Every edition got larger. She did a final revision in like 2006 before she died. Now, in the meantime, I have to say, Onetti was married 3 times to women who were not Idea Vilariño. And so, at first, it's a passionate book about her love for him, and then I think by the end, it's about the idea of love, and sort of the impossibility of love for a woman who is really as independent, an independent scholar, teacher, essayist, journalist, as Idea Vilariño was in her life. So, they're all about Onetti, but by the end, to me, they're about more than Onetti. And I'm going to read some of the poems that are in the Poet Lore issue, the amazing Poet Lore issue. And I'm going to splice in poems by 2 other women Uruguayan poets right in the middle for reasons that will become clear when we get to it.
Un huésped, no sos mío, no estás en mi vida, a mi lado, no comes en mi mesa, no reís ni cantás, ni vivís para mí, somos ajenos, tú y yo misma, y mi casa. Sos un extraño, un huésped, que no busca, no quiere más que una cama. A veces, ¿qué puedo hacer? Cedértela, pero yo vivo sola.
And you have to think they're writing these for Onetti. A guest. A guest. You're not mine. You're not here in my life, at my side. You don't eat at my table, or laugh, or sing, or live for me. Or someone else's, you and me too, and my house. You're a stranger, a guest. I don't look for or want more than, you don't look for or want more than a bed once in a while. What can I do except give it to you? But I live alone.
Entre tus brazos, entre mis brazos, entre las blandas sábanas, entre la noche tiernos, solos, feroces, entre la sombra, entre las horas, entre un antes y un después.
Between your arms, between my arms, between the soft sheets, between the night, we are tender, alone, fierce, between the shadow, between the hours, between a before and an after.
O fueron 9. Tal vez tuvimos solo 7 noches, no sé, no las conté. ¿Cómo hubiera podido? Tal vez no más que 6, o fueron 9, no sé, pero valieron, como el más largo amor. Tal vez de 4 o 5 noches como esas, pero precisamente como esas tal vez pueda vivirse como de un largo amor, toda una vida.
Or were there 9? Perhaps we had only 7 nights. I don't know. I didn't count them. How could I? Perhaps no more than 6, or maybe there were 9. I don't know, but they were worth as much as the longest love. Perhaps with 4 or 5 nights like this, but precisely like this, perhaps one could live as if living a long love, a whole life.
No hay nadie. No estoy. No esperes más. Hace tiempo me he ido. No busques. No preguntes. No llames que no hay nadie. Es una loca brisa de otros días que gime. Es un pañuelo al viento que remeda señales. No llames. No destroces tu mano golpeando. No grites. No preguntes. No hay nadie. No hay nadie.
There is nobody. I am not there. Do not wait any longer. Some time ago I left. Do not look for me. Do not ask for me. Do not call because there is no one. It is a wild breeze of other days that moans. It is a handkerchief in the wind that imitates signals. Do not call. Do not shatter your hand knocking. Do not shout. Do not ask. There is nobody. There is nobody. One of the things that came between Idea Vilariño and Onetti was the dictatorship that came to Uruguay, the military dictatorship that came to Uruguay, and about the same time as Argentina, which most people are a little more familiar with. And Onetti was actually sent to prison for a short period of time, and then after many appeals from outside, he went into exile and he went to Spain. Many writers of that generation of 45 left Uruguay. Some didn't come back. Onetti didn't. And Mario Benedetti went into exile. Idea Vilariño stayed in Montevideo. She lost her teaching position, and she was isolated, left in Montevideo, cut off from what had been her literary world. And this period of time is very very problematic, very troubled in Uruguayan history, and there are many poets who wrote about it, and one of the other poets who wrote about it is a poet that I translated, Circe Maya. The book The Invisible Bridge is a selection of her poetry, and she is 10 years younger than Idea Vilariño, but her husband, Ariel, was sent to prison under the dictatorship. He was a doctor who had been accused of giving medical aid to the Tupamara guerrillas. And when she writes poems, she doesn't write directly about this period, and neither really does Idea Vilariño, but if you're Uruguayan, people will read a poem and they'll look to see when it was published or when it was written to sort of see whether silence is just silence or whether it's silence. And this poem of Circe Maya's makes me think about Idea Vilariño sitting in Montevideo and all of what was going on in Uruguay at the time. It's called Treason. The last son did not say to him, "I am the last son." Nothing prepared him. The water slid over his body, and he didn't know that this was the way that the water said goodbye. He did not know. No one told him anything. When night came, it came to stay, and he never knew. And then there's a piece that's probably the most famous thing that Circe Maya is best known for, but it actually isn't one of her poems. It was never in one of her books, but it's the lyrics that she wrote for a poem, the lyrics she wrote for a song that was sung by Daniel Viglietti. Daniel Viglietti is often called the Bob Dylan of Uruguay, but I think he's sort of more the Pete Seeger of Uruguay, if you can understand that distinction there. And this song became very popular all through Latin America as something about the disappeared. And it's often done, there's a wonderful version on YouTube of a performance where Daniel Viglietti would sing this song and Mario Benedetti would recite one of his poems about the disappeared. And the song is called Otra Voz Canta, but the poem version of it is called Por Detrás de Mi Voz. Behind my voice, listen, listen, another voice sings. It comes from behind, from far. It comes from the buried mouths, and it sings. They say, they are not dead. Listen to them. Listen to them. While the voice rises, remembers them, and sings. Listen, listen, another voice sings. They say they live now in your eyes. Sustain them with your eyes, with your words, so that they are not lost, so that they do not fall. They are not only memory, they are open to life, open wide. Listen, listen, another voice sings. And I'm going to read one poem by another poet who is, again, 10 years younger than Circe Maya, so 20 years younger than Idea Vilariño, but went really through the same experience under the dictatorship, and that's Tatiana Oroño. And she has this poem, too, which is clearly about this period in Latin American history, and it's called The Discounted. Here, something has happened. Until recently, we were sun and the salt of the earth, Homo sapiens, Max Scheele. Now we are this, those that are outside the count of the 90,000 dead or disappeared, the eyes, the ears, wary. And so when we come back to Idea Vilariño's poems, I think it's hard not to think of this period in her life when reading her poems.
Ya no será, ya no viviremos juntos, no criaré tu hijo, no coseré tu ropa, no tendré de noche, no te besaré al irme, nunca sabrás quién fui. ¿Por qué me amaron otros? No llegaré a saber. ¿Por qué ni cómo nunca? No sé si era de verdad lo que dijiste que era, ni quién fuiste, ni quién fui para ti, ni cómo hubiera sido. Vivir juntos, queremos, esperamos, estar. Ya no soy más que yo, para siempre y tú. Ya no serás para mí, más que tú. Ya no estás en un día futuro. No sabré dónde vives, con quién. No sé si te acuerdas. No me abrazarás nunca, como esa noche, nunca. No volveré a tocarte, no te veré morir.
This is probably one of her very best known poems. Not now. Now it will not be, not now. We will not live together. I will not raise your son. I will not sew your clothes. I will not have you at night. I will not kiss you before I leave. You will never know who I was, why others loved me. I will never come to know why or how or if what you said was true, or who you were, or what I was to you, or how it would have been to live together, to love each other, to wait for each other, to be. Now I am only myself forever, and you now are not for me, only yourself. You are no longer there, a day in the future. I will not know where you live, with whom, or if you remember. You will never embrace me like that night, never. I will not touch you again. I will not see you die.
Adiós. Adiós. Salgo como de un traje, estrecho y delicado, difícilmente un pie, después de despacio, el otro. Salgo como debajo, un derrumbe, arrastrándome, sorda al dolor, deshecha de piel, y sin ayuda. Salgo penosamente, al fin, de ese pasado, de ese arduo aprendizaje, de esa agónica vida.
And again, you sort of think of her going on with her life. Goodbye. Goodbye. I leave as if in a tight and delicate skirt with difficulty, one foot, then slowly the other. I leave as if from under a collapsed building, dragging myself, deaf to pain, shredding my skin, and without help. I leave painfully in the end. This past, this grueling apprenticeship, this agonizing life.
That's the end. Do I have the Spanish? Okay. Perdón. Adios. Aquí, lejos, te borro, estás borrado.
I think it's a sign of how she felt this book, that every time she rewrote it, there was another poem called Adios. And this is yet another one. Goodbye. Here, far away, I erase you. You are erased. And then, again, because I think I turned to Circe Maya, a very different sort of poet, perhaps for a different view of pain in life from the dictatorship or just life in general. Circe's husband is still alive. He did come back from prison, but she's lost a son. This is a poem of hers called Scars. Scars, open wounds on the skins of time. Do they scar? The days place their bandages. The bloody traces are smooth and washed. Do the wounded heal? Yes, totally. Though at night, the wound bleeds sometimes. Thanks.
And here's a question. How, well, so we just want to know, how did you come to Vilariño and to the other women, your wine poets that you translated?
I went to Uruguay in 2010 for a sabbatical year from University of Wisconsin to learn Spanish. So this is all relatively new for me. And the first book of poems that I bought was by Idea Vilariño. I was standing in the bookstore Geni in Boulevard España, and I bought the complete poems of Idea Vilariño, which had actually just come out. And so she was the first poet that I read, and I was sure that all of her work would have been translated already. I was really naive about the poetry translation world. But I didn't, I think it was so early in my process of learning Spanish and learning about Uruguayan Spanish that I just thought I should find someone else to translate her work. And the first person that I actually picked up on and translated was Circe Maya, this book. And that was a story where I was actually at a friend's beach place in Atlantica, on the beach outside of Montevideo, and for 3 Kings. And we put our shoes out, for Epiphany, you put your shoes out with straw in them, and the camel comes by and stops, eats the straw, and then the 3 wise men, one of them leaves your present. And I got the complete poems of Circe Maya. And for some reason, I started reading those right away. Everyone went to the beach, and I just sat in the hammock and read her poems. And I, again, thought they would all be translated. And I came back, and I looked, and none of hers had been translated. A few in anthologies, some in the 70s. And so I needed to start translating those. I found her email address. Uruguay is a wonderful little country, and if the first person you know doesn't know how to contact them, that's amazing, but the second person will. The first person I asked said, oh yes, she was my high school teacher. Here's her email address. So I did Circe Maya, and I actually literally walked around at ALTA, which is the American Literary Translators Association, saying somebody should translate Circe Maya. Idea Vilariño. Somebody should really translate Idea Vilariño, and no one took me up on it. And so last February, I was at the VCCA, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, for a month, and I just sat there and translated, 20 hours a day. It's so much so that I got a stiff neck from looking at the book and typing at the same time. And a friend who's here had to take me to a masseuse to get me straightened down. So I just did it, and there is different voices as could possibly be. I don't know if you can really tell from this, but there's a lot of just really powerful female anger in Idea Vilariño a lot of times. That's really amazing. I mean, this is 1957, some of these were written. This is before Sylvia Plath. This is before Anne Sexton. Very sexually explicit, very honest, emotional poems. And Circe Maya is zen. So they were about as different as 2 women poets could possibly be, both coming out of a country with 3 million people.
So it is said that things are lost and then they're also found in translation. So what do you think has been lost and found in the translation into English of Vilariño?
Well, the hardest thing with Vilariño is I spent a lot of time there, articles, and she wrote herself about how she had a system of stresses in her language. And she tracked them in her poems. And I found that impossible to do in English without rendering poems that would seem the opposite of natural and modern. I'm not saying that it couldn't be done. One thing about translation is it's like playing, Beethoven or something to your musician. You know you're not the last person who's ever going to play them. You're not the definitive version. Someone may come along and do something different. But any kind of formal poetry, you make a decision whether to keep it or not. And her poetry doesn't rhyme. It's not in a form that you would recognize as formal poetry or that I would necessarily. But I did spend a lot of time thinking about her system of stresses, and it just, as far as I could tell, it wasn't possible in English. Her language is relatively straightforward. Both she and Jesse Maya come from a tradition in Uruguayan poetry that is pretty conversational and direct. It strives for a kind of simplicity for different reasons. But there's an example of a sort of classic poetry dilemma in the title of Ja No, or Ya No, if you're not Uruguayan. This is just a perfect example of what you lose in translation. Ya means both now and already. And so in Uruguay, people use it all the time. I think because it sounds so much better than sha than it does as ya. So like the most common expression, or one of them is shata, which is, ya está, and people can use that as just like, here's your dinner, or enough, shata. and it to translate it as not now works in English. It works through the poem. The other possibility would be now, comma, no. But you lose the idea that it's also already. So, for example, ya is the word that's used in the Vallejo poem. Where's this line now? Because I can remember it. Black stone on a white stone, where it's usually translated, that this day, you have already died this day in Paris. And so there, what about the exact line? It's usually translated black stone on a white stone. I will die in Paris in a rainstorm on a day I already remember. And so that's ya, and not a day I now remember. And so when you translate it, it doesn't really work to translate it as already all the way through the poem, already not, already no, already I know I won't, have your child, already I know I won't do these things. But you do lose the idea that it's both now, this immediate realization, and that you sort of already knew that. And there's just no way to bring that across. So that's just one of those things that just drives you nuts. But I think every translator is going to go, yeah.
Well, you've also translated Tatiana Vilariño and Treason, which you're talking about, and they're both alive. So how is it different to translate poets that are alive versus poets that have passed away, such as Idea Vilariño?
Well, the first thing is you have to find who has the rights to their poems. That was Idea Vilariño was the first time I had to, again, everyone knows everything in order. I asked someone who in the world has the rights to Idea Vilariño's poems because she didn't have any children. And I did, and I was able to get the permission to do the translation. But in some ways, Jesse Maya was almost the same. Jesse Maya will not talk about her poems, nor would she look at my translations. I mean, we're close friends. I go to visit her all the time. But she just has no real ego or interest in her poems. So, I would bring a pile of books of her poems that have been translated in magazines, like in the New Yorker, and I would bring them, and she would just read other people's poems. And she's translated Shakespeare into Spanish, so it's not that she can't read the translation. After I published them, she noted a couple places she really liked something, but she won't really talk about her poems. I think if Idea Vilariño was alive, because I've talked to so many people who know her, and she just died in 2009, she would talk your ear off about her poems. So I really regret not having gotten to talk to her. I think in some ways she was a difficult person, somewhat. Not quite as zen about her work as Jesse was, so maybe her being dead is not an advantage. I wish I could talk to her, but at least there, I just have to trust that I'm doing the right thing. Tatiana Vilariño is a completely different case. She makes up words. And so I honestly don't think, I have a feeling that if I don't finish a book of hers before something, I hope she lives to be 110, she's just in her 70s, I think that no one would be able to do it. There are literally things that I could ask 100 Uruguayans what they meant and no one would know. There's a title of one of her poems that's Madror, M-A-D-R-O-R, and I thought it was a proper noun. I Googled it, I asked 20 different people, and then I wrote to Tatiana. I could have done that first, but she tends to write very long answers that don't quite answer the question. But it's the word madre and dolor put together for mother pain. So, how would you know that if the poet didn't tell you? So that's a classic example of why but some of her stuff is just mysterious, verging on the incomprehensible without a conversation.
Okay, and this next question actually addresses the sort of the elephant in the room, which is the amount of women poets that Uruguay has produced, especially in the last century. And I'm quoting from your introduction, you saying, this country of a mere 3.3 million people has produced a disproportionate number of strong women poets in a literary world dominated by men. Can you talk about this fascinating phenomenon?
Yes, it's absolutely true, and I actually typed out a list. I think in my papers, so I wouldn't mention people's names. But it's a phenomenon that makes me impatient with these anthologies that have no women poets in it. I could fill a world-class anthology with nothing but Uruguayan women poets. And there's a lot of discussion there about why that's true. Part of it, I think, is because there was early universal education, and because it's a relatively middle-class country. So, but there's actually a real sense among the women poets of something that's handed from each generation to the next generation. They're all perfectly aware of the mothers before them. Like, Jesse Maya lives in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's in Tacuarembó. People don't let a Tacuarembese don't tell someone from Tacuarembó I said it was the middle of nowhere. But it's 5 miles from, 5 hours by bus from Montevideo, where half of the people, 1.5 million people in the country live. And yet people get on a bus and they go to visit Cersei. They go make that pilgrimage. And so, like, Juana de Vilariño, who was born in 1892, and Elmira Agostini, born in 1892, 1886 is sort of one generation. And then there are these wonderful other poets, besides Idea Vilariño, in the generation of 45, Amanda Berenguer and Ida Vitali, who actually lives in Texas. And then there are people who are sort of outliers. It's a wonderful, not part of that group, sort of the same age. There's a wonderful Afro-Uruguaya poet, Virginia Brindis de Sales, another wonderful woman who died early in a plane wreck that I would love to translate, Susana Soca. There are 2 wonderful translations by this wonderful, surreal, totally different than Idea Vilariño, Cersei Maya, surreal, sexual, steamy, religious prose poems, Marosa de Giorgio. And it goes on up to, I've got this anthology of younger emerging Uruguayan poets coming out. Half of them were easily women. There was no problem with that. So there are people who are in their 20s that are in that anthology. And there's 3 of the actually male poets that I know in Uruguay now are doing this wonderful project where they go into high schools and teach poetry workshops, which isn't normal there. And they're published an online anthology called In la Camina de los Perros, which is, they call an anthology ultra joven. So it's, they're like 16 to 18 years old, and the women, I'm telling you, they just blow the guys away. And so I really think, oh, come on, there have to be, I can't believe this is an isolated phenomenon, but I'm very Uruguay-centric, and so I would like to see a re-examination of the role of women poets in Latin America. I can't think that Uruguay is the only country where this phenomenon is true.
But have you found, like, what is it about that culture? Like, do you think that the generation of 45?
No, I really think it starts earlier than that. I think it starts partly with some respect for Uruguayan culture for poets. I mean, Juana de Vilariño is on the 1,000 peso note. But I think that it has to do with a lot of things about Uruguay. It's a lay country without the same degree of pressure on women by the Catholic Church. This complete separation of church and state. They're women, all the women that I've listed here, including, Idea Vilariño, they supported themselves, she never married. A lot of them taught school. It's just a culture in which I think women were able to establish themselves as literary figures earlier and keep up this tradition. Now, I don't mean to say that it was easy. When you look at the generation of 45, I think you can clearly see sexism in the attitude of the men in the group towards the women. But there are 3 important women in that group, in that literary group. So I just think that it's kind of amazing. It's something I'm more and more interested in. And Uruguayans have written about it too, but I think sometimes they don't quite understand how unusual it is because they live in it.
Okay, we're going to open up for questions from the audience.
And since we don't have a mic for you to use, we'll just call on you if you raise your hand.
This is usually when I say that I'm a teacher, and if you don't ask questions, I'll call on you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I must say that I really, I'm from the Caribbean. So, what is going on here is very interesting. And, the Caribbean, we have produced some very interesting women poets also, right? You mentioned political places in Puerto Rico. Cuba. But the question that really begs to be asked here is that obviously she grows up at a time when all around her there's these huge political, socioeconomic problems in Latin America, right?
Right.
I mean, the Condor problems, you know, Chile, I mean, okay. Did she, and obviously she was part of groups of people, intellectuals, who often those parts of the world tend to drift in a radical left-wing direction, right? Juan Gelman, think about him, right? One of my favorite figures that I've heard. Okay, did she ever write political poetry? Is there a tradition in Uruguay of women writing political poetry, or this more male things and forgiving the sexism, et cetera, et cetera? And did she ever talk about the dictatorship in an open, direct way, or was this all much more hidden and much more metaphorical as some of the poets you have read before? And what is the relationship also with other women poets in Latin America? Do they get together? Do they meet a lot, or are they somewhat isolated from one another?
I would say, there's complicated questions here. I would say, you know, Idea Vilariño was openly left-wing, and she lost her job under the dictatorship, and, you know, was kind of lucky not to have had to go into exile. And as were all the other poets in the generation of 45. But I do say that there is a tendency of the women to write more personal poetry and less political poetry. Mario Benedetti is just openly, relentlessly, sometimes the young poets actually find him tediously political. I don't find him that way, but there's this kind of pressure, pushback against this younger generation, against Benedetti, who's the most famous Uruguayan poet in Uruguay. And I think that even now, in the anthology of emerging Uruguayan poets, the women tend to write about personal things, and the men write more political things or historical things. I see that same thing with my own MFA students sometimes, and it's kind of troubling trend. It would not be that different, I think, if you're looking again to Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton-looking people in the United States, that the barriers that the women were breaking were maybe not political ones. As far as connections between poets in other parts of Latin America, yes, but not as much maybe as you would think. Uruguay has a kind of Europe-facing orientation in their poetry and their culture, but there has been over the last 100 years, really, is it 100 years now? I need to correct that. The usual trip that after the dictatorship fell, the usual trip that an Uruguayan writer gets to make is to Cuba, because the Cubans fly you in, and no, we're not flying them in here. So there are certainly connections of conferences of South American poets that happen there, and there are other things that happen. The Paraguayan embassy or the Peruvian embassy will put together an event to bring people in. But I would say that the poetry, as far as person-to-person encounters between the poets of Idea Vilariño's generation and who didn't go out into exile, and other poets of South America, relatively limited. That doesn't mean that they weren't reading everything from Europe or everything from South America, but it wasn't that easy to get out of Uruguay and come back in. Lots of international travels are relatively recent, but that's my impression.
I also see that Latin American countries try to look at Europe like more than each other.
Yes.
So that we will all be Paris, Rome, Spain. That's what we are too. So we are. The focus is on Europe.
Uruguay is particularly that way. The insult against it, I guess, in the rest of Latin America is they think that they're European. They stand with their back to Brazil, and they have some connection to Argentina, but otherwise they're looking at Europe, and they have very strong poetic connections to France, which was surprising when I was first there.
I was curious at your choice of poems to read in sequence, because you talked first about the great love she had, and most of the poems that you read were about the anticipation of that, and I'm just curious how you made that choice.
I would say it is the choice of Idea Vilariño. Even though it's called love poems, they are mostly, my bed is empty and where the heck are you poems. They are more angry poems than actually remembrance of a night or in the moment poems. Now, these are the selection that was in Poetlore, but I think you would find that in the entire book. They are more prickly or angry than interesting too. I mean, it's someone asserting their rights in a relationship. So perhaps in that sense, love poems, it's almost a misnomer, but that's what they are for her.
How is translating and living abroad affected your teaching practice? Affected your teaching?
I've started to bring translation into the classroom. We don't actually teach a separate workshop in translation, although I'd like to, and I've been visiting a lot of them lately. The first time I went to a translation workshop, and the theory of that in the United States is that people are translating all kinds of poems that the teacher can't read the original language, which seems strange to me at first. So I brought it into my graduate student workshops, into my undergraduate student workshops. We do a unit on it. And so last time, for example, in my graduate workshop, there were people translating Turkish and Swahili. And so, you try to connect them with people in that language if they need help, and you sort of talk about the general problems that there are in translating, which there's some sort of systemic ones no matter what language you're translating, and you read the English versions to see if they're working as poems. And that is fine for an actual unit. I'm looking forward to and a little scared about teaching an entire semester of it, although I've now sat through a lot of translation workshops that other people taught because I've been a visitor in the class.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Walter Benjamin?
Yes, of course.
You know, he wrote an essay on translation and about how the translation, in each translation after that, basically follows messianic language. Like for each, a lot of people think translation is not an art, and he was very much that each transportation is that. And Kafka is a great example too, because they translated everything for him, and it was art. It was beautiful.
I think translation is a tricky and slippery business. I actually got a beautiful book when I was just down in Uruguay. There's a wonderful press that publishes mostly poetry called Jagaru, which is Uruguay backwards. And they did a project where they got someone to translate poems through a whole roundabout of languages, right? So you could translate it from, I have to look at the book now to remember, but from Spanish to French, from French to German, without people looking back to the original, and then all the way back to Spanish to see how it's a completely different poem by the time it gets back to the original. It's a poem in every language, but it's not the same poem, and that just sort of tells you all the decisions that get made along the way.
Yeah, Jesse, knowing your prose, I have some ideas of what you're interested in when you're writing English, when you're writing prose in English. So it would be your Alice stories or your novella Brazil, or even your memoir Space. It seems to me that you're really interested in how geography and place kind of inform character or personality. And I'm curious to know then, in your role as a translator, do you bring a proclivity like that, or interest in some of the things that we might see as readers in your prose? Do you bring that to your translations, or do you have to set your own proclivities aside? Is there a different goal, or is there something in between?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about that, but I think it's probably one of the reasons that I'm interested in Uruguay. Uruguay is a country everyone chose in one way or another. It's a country of immigrants like the United States. And then there's these constant choices, like there was people who left during the dictatorship. There was a terrible economic crash in 2001, which is the biggest economic influence on the young poets. A lot of them had to go out and work. Families had to sell everything and move to Israel for a while. And so I think maybe I'm bringing my own obsession with place. I was born in France and grew up in different places in the United States, and I have a sense of displacement that's in a lot of my work. So maybe I identify with that a bit in the Uruguayans. I don't think it's not the same thing where maybe you bring your interest to the poet you choose, but I think when you're translating, you put that aside. I wouldn't write poems like Idea Vilariño. I would aspire maybe to be a little more like Jose Maya, but I'm not that same. And at Idea Vilariño, I'm not that, I don't know, open about my emotions. But you just get into it, and especially when you're translating a book, the more poems you translate by someone, the more you understand them, and you take them on. And so actually for me, having written both fiction and memoir, which is sort of the most revealing thing, and then a lot of poetry, the great thing about translation is sort of leaving your ego aside. You really are doing someone else's work, even though I'm saying it's not like, I don't want you to think it's completely transparent, the choices that are made. But out for a while. I'm really enjoying a vacation from self.
Yeah, one more question. Go ahead.
I was going to say, how much do you have to know about these people when you decide to translate them? Do you have to read a lot of their memoirs and books about them, or what do you do to understand the poem?
It depends on the person, because it depends on how much there is. So with Circe Maya, there is actually just her books. So her collected poems is about 400 pages, and now she has a new book. And then meeting her was interesting. There's some interviews with her, which I read, but there isn't really critical work on her of any volume. I mean, maybe there's a chapter in an Uruguayan book that I might have read. I'm trying to think if there's one, and there are two studies of sort of all of Uruguayan poetry. Idea Vilariño was more complicated because there's a fair amount written about her, but nothing like you'd see about an American author of the same, importance. This woman who holds the rights to her estates put together a sort of collection of letters and photographs. Every time I ask someone in Uruguay if they knew Idea Vilariño, they have a different Idea Vilariño story. How much that's useful or not, I don't know. So I did just sort of try to go into the poems. So where it came up, for example, is right now, which version you want to translate of the book? It's like Leaves of Grass, she's changing it. I decided not to do the 57 edition because it's missing most of her famous poems, like the one I read, Chardonnay. And I didn't end up doing the 2006 one because it's got about 20 additional poems in it, and I just thought, I don't know, should be enough already. So I actually just translated the 75 edition because I thought that was really the one that everyone remembered. I walked around and said, which one do you, to Uruguayans who all own copies in their houses. It was sort of that edition that they own, that had all the famous poems, but not the ones that she wrote 40 years after this relationship. So, so I don't know if that's the one that will end up being published. A lot of it has to do with the publisher and what they decide to do, whether they want to do the comprehensive version. But that I think I wouldn't have known unless I dug into her life and was sort of going into what she was thinking about.
Well, on that note, much thanks to Jesse Lee Kercheval for a great reading without a mic. Thanks too to Catalina Gomez, and hope you stick around, buy copies of Poet Lore and buy copies of Jesse Lee's translations. And we hope to see you again. We have an event tomorrow at noon with the Hispanic Division, Colombian poet Alvaro Mutis, the University of Virginia professor, what's her name? Charlotte Rogers is coming, and that's in the Woodall Pavilion across the street. So if you want some more exciting poetry from another part of South America, and you're free at noon tomorrow, come and check it out. Thanks so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.